Phantom's a walk-on during Fall Fest. I would not have it any other way. This is what happens when it's a station wait for Phantom. Look at how fast everybody is walking. Goodbye, guys. I'll catch up with you later. Worth it for Phantom, though. I think it goes without saying that I'm a huge fan of Phantom's Revenge. In all the times I've been to Kennywood over the years, I've ridden this coaster hundreds of times. It's a bizarre coaster creation that went from an Aero Looper to a Morgan Hypercoaster, and yet this clash of old and new is part of the reason I like it so much. I've had many years to become familiar with every aspect of Phantom since I took my first ride on it in 2004, so when I planned a trip to Dorney Park this past summer, you better believe I was excited to ride Steel Force and see how it compares. Both are Morgan Hypercoasters, but with considerable differences which I'll get into in a minute. But first I want to make one thing clear. This is by no means a versus video. I'm not trying to determine which coaster is superior over the other. In fact, let's get this out of the way now. Phantom is still my favorite coaster of all time. However, I do have a lot of nostalgia and nearly 20 years spent riding it, so the odds would be stacked against Steel Force if I pit them against each other. Instead, what I want to do is give my impressions of Steel Force and how it, a ground-up Morgan Hyper, compares to Phantom, which was modified by Morgan into the current layout. Steel Force predates Phantom's Revenge by 4 years, but the original Steel Phantom predates Steel Force by another 6. I don't know who inspired who here, but it wouldn't be too random of me to say that these coasters have similar themes, or at least mascots. A shadowy, hooded figure looming over the entrance could describe either attraction, but whereas Kennywood's Phantom is only known as such, Steel Force's mascot is actually named Morgan, a reference that only coaster nerds will get, and I love Dorney Park for that. This was my first experience riding in Morgan's own hypercoaster trains, which Phantom does not use. At first glance, they bear a striking resemblance to the Aerodynamics hypercoaster trains used on Magnum XL 200, right down to the lap bars, but I found these to be more comfortable to sit in. The Morgan lap bar anchors to the floor rather than to the side of the train like on Phantom, so you don't have quite as much room above your legs to get airtime. One aspect of Steel Force I was kind of disappointed with is the lift hill, and yeah, this is going to come off as a real nitpicky statement, but I'm a coaster nerd, make fun of me all you want. Steel Force's lift hill is really quiet. Meanwhile, you can hear Phantom going up the lift hill all across the park. That is so much better. I love the sound of an Aero chain lift. They really kept one of the best parts of an Aero coaster when they renovated this into Phantom's Revenge, at least from the audio side of things. The first drops both have their own strengths, but they are not at all similar. Phantom has that iconic curving first drop, whereas Steel Force drops straight ahead. I do love that curved drop, but I think I prefer the first drop on Steel Force, as I was actually able to get a bit of airtime in the back row, and Steel Force does have the taller first drop by about 40 feet, so you get more time to enjoy it. Phantom picks up the slack with the second drop, and need I say more? The second drop is legendary among coaster enthusiasts. The dive through Thunderbolt reaching 89 miles per hour, the head chopper, it's just unreal. Steel Force can't really compare to that. I mean, it sends you through a tunnel, and I'm not gonna knock a good tunnel, so I did enjoy that, but here is where the layouts showcase their speed. I got some nice floater air coming out of my seat on Steel Force's first hill, and yeah, I know people like to say that Steel Force doesn't have airtime, but I got floater on this hill, so take that for what you will. Maybe it's just because I don't weigh much. I mean, I do fit in pretty well with the skeletons at Kennywood right now, so maybe that's it. Anyway, this first hill is fine. Nothing intense, but still a fun start to the coaster. Next, however, is my favorite part of Steel Force, the Helix. This thing pulls some serious positive Gs, and it's massive, so it lasts a decently long time. Phantom has a Helix too, but it follows that insane second drop and is shorter. It's also an uphill Helix, whereas Steel Force's is downhill, so while I sometimes gray out at the beginning of Phantom's Helix because of the second drop, I grayed out toward the end of Steel Force's Helix as it got progressively more intense. Here's where the layouts differ even more as Steel Force heads into the mid-course brake run. Phantom, being a pretty short terrain coaster, doesn't have one. That means that it keeps its speed throughout the entire layout, but at the cost of being over pretty quickly. Steel Force goes on for a solid minute longer, but the mid-course kills some of that momentum. Thankfully, the brakes weren't hitting very hard the day I was there. From here on, it's all airtime all the way back to the station. Phantom's airtime hills are something that have to be ridden to be believed. It's some of the most powerful ejector you'll experience on any coaster, and I never get tired of it. Thanks to Phantom's unique restraints, it's possible to get plenty of room between them and your legs, allowing for that insane airtime. When you glide into those brakes for the first time, you'll be processing what just happened for the next few minutes at least. Steel Force doesn't quite deliver the same level of airtime. The best way I can describe Steel Force's airtime hills are Magnum's airtime hills, but with none of the trademark aero jankiness. Much like Phantom, Magnum is famous for its insane ejector airtime, but its restraints often work against this, leading many who ride it to consider it a painful experience. I never had much of a problem with it, and I do love me some Magnum, but Steel Force definitely has the smoother track. These airtime hills are more gradual and exceptionally smooth, and there's 4 of them in a row before you reach the station. The airtime you get is considered ejector, but I'd label it as borderline floater. Of course it depends on where you sit, but Steel Force's hills seem more drawn out when compared to Phantom. Here, you're up and back down in your seat in under a second, over and over again, whereas Steel Force holds you up there for a second or two. What I'm trying to say is that Phantom likes to throw you around, while Steel Force lifts you up and then sets you back down more gently. Both these coasters have a considerable amount of momentum when heading into the brake run, so they don't lose much of it over the course of the layout. Steel Force does lose more because of that mid-course brake run, but it builds the speed back up when going over those airtime hills. Phantom doesn't have to build speed back up because of its shorter layout. It goes down the second drop and flies through the rest of the track. Yeah, it's over sooner, but man is it a rush. It was nice to be on a Morgan Hypercoaster where I had more time to enjoy the ride experience, but this meant that I didn't find it quite as re-rideable. Don't get me wrong, I'd happily marathon either of these, but Phantom's aggressive airtime and superior restraints are what keep me coming back. Going back to Steel Force, I absolutely love how this coaster looks. The red track and silver supports are a striking combination, and the track runs almost the entire length of the park, acting as a backdrop no matter where you are inside Dorney. You've got those chunky Morgan supports running nearly the entire length of the track, and we don't really have that at Kennywood. The first half of Phantom is made up of old aero supports, and most of the Morgan supports are down in the ravine, which means you typically can't see them unless you look from an uncommon angle. You don't realize how huge these columns are until you're right next to them, and Steel Force has that look down. It might not be the most intense thing in the world, but you can't deny that to a new coaster enthusiast, this would be an imposing sight. It's a photogenic coaster that looks great in pictures and videos, as you can see here. Fun to watch, but even more fun to ride. I have to say, as a Morgan fan, I did come away impressed by Steel Force. It was nothing mind-blowing, but it's not nearly as mediocre as many enthusiasts would have you believe. It offers some good airtime and a nice long layout, especially for a coaster largely built over flat land. And that's the main advantage that Phantom has over Steel Force aside from airtime, its use of terrain. The elevation changes and diving down into that ravine are second to none, and the 2 passes through Thunderbolt are just the icing on the cake. Nothing will dethrone Phantom in my eyes, but Steel Force opened them to a world of other hypercoasters that until now I had yet to experience. It's one of the gems in Dorney Park's lineup and extremely re-rideable, and I know I'll be back soon enough to ride it again if you know what I mean. I'm very happy to have finally made the trip to Dorney and ridden this. It's worth it if you're a Morgan fan or a Phantom Phanatic, and I definitely want to seek out Wild Thing and Mamba to see how they compare. I don't think I'm getting down to Mexico anytime soon though, so we'll have to hold off on that one. And Steel Dragon 2000? I've got more US parks to visit first. Anyway, that's going to be it for this video. If you've ridden either of these coasters, or any other Morgan coasters for that matter, feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, especially if you grew up riding one of them. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time for more Hypercoasters here on Rampaging Rex Productions.